Have you ever wondered which is more important for weightlifting, strength or technique?
So the sport of weightlifting involves a very high degree of technical proficiency. It involves large amounts of kind of max strength. It involves speed, power production, flexibility, and a host of other kind of uh, factors of fitness. What we're going to talk about today is whether you rely too much on just technical proficiency or you might rely too much on just maximum strength. We're going to talk about how you might identify which group you lay in, or if you lay in one of those groups at all, and then things to do to possibly improve your weightlifting by kind of bringing up one of the other factors. So I think one thing you often see is like different countries will put different emphasis, or different training programs will put different emphasis on, be it technique or strength or power. So one of those things, like there's kind of clear examples of both. There's also different weight classes. So like the heavier weight classes will often put more emphasis on technique, or more emphasis on power and speed and strength. So Garth, what's an example of like some of the countries that might have more technical proficiency but less input or less emphasis on power?
So interesting enough, the Bulgarians would have been ones who put primary emphasis on technique. Now their technique may have been rough, but it definitely got the job done. So their emphasis was technique is the training that they were doing. So maximum snatch and maximum clean and jerk. And they were kind of putting maximum emphasis on developing the best possible technique that lifter could do by doing the most amount of lifts. So to them, and most people will understand that lifts above 90% are a different kind of lift. So you hear us talk an awful lot about that, where we talk about 75% feels different to 85%, and there's different kind of techniques, and they feel different, and they have different emphases on speed and strength, and they feel different to your body. They have different outcomes across all. So not only Olympic lifts, but then strength lifts. Okay, and so in weightlifting, what's very, very important is the technique at 90% and above. And so the Bulgarians' philosophy was doing the most amount of lifts. And so because the technique at 90% and above is so different to the other lifts, they spend most of their time focusing on this technique. So now we know they did an awful lot of squats, and we don't know if they did a lot of pulls, and we don't hear a whole lot about them doing any kind of pulls, or maybe a little bit of pulls. But well, they didn't put a huge amount. So obviously we heard stories of them doing huge lifts, but it's not often we heard stories of them doing massive amounts of squats, or like having huge squats.
Even any accessory movements, really, like even like
strict pressing, push pressing,
or lifts from the hang, or powers. Like it was super, super specific. I think an example of like a training system that might focus a lot more on strength than it might on like kind of classical lifts or really specific training would be the kind of like, in inverted commas, like American weightlifting, or even British weightlifting system, whereby, or the European weightlifting system, where you have people doing like classical strength movements like squatting, pulls, presses, rows, and then they're doing the lifts and derivatives of the lifts on top of that. And the kind of system whereby you think about just getting stronger, and then that kind of transferring over into your lifts with a very low degree of specificity in the training.
Yeah, I think one of the best training philosophies or training cultures who have the almost one of the best relationship, and it works out best for them, was someone we saw, like, was Romania. So they put a huge amount of emphasis on doing the snatch and clean and jerk, and doing them a lot. But then they also put a lot of emphasis on doing things like heavy squats and heavy pulls, and like not taking them to the absolute maximum, but taking them to a limit where your pull was very strong. So like Gabriel talked about before the Olympics, his best deadlift was 305 kilos, which is an enormous for an 85 kilo lifter. And then if we move somewhere down along to like Chinese weightlifters, we see them put a huge emphasis on strength, but also they obviously spend an awful lot of time perfecting technique. So we see the Chinese lifters having huge snatch grip deadlifts and actively doing them an awful lot, and having massive squats. So ideally we are trying to be as strong as possible with the best technique possible, but then ultimately, to facilitate the best technique you possibly have, you need to be able to hold positions. So you need strength, and you need ability to produce power in these positions. So that comes from strength as well. So producing force. So obviously producing this force as fast as possible and as little time as possible, but be able to move through positions in strong positions. That is very important to be very strong. So ultimately, you want to be strong and have perfect technique.
Yeah. So there's kind of key indicators of, right, this person may be a small bit too weak, or they mightn't have the necessary strength to build their numbers from the place they are now. There's also indicators of, okay, this person is like muscling through everything and just using their strength numbers. So what are some of the ways you might notice if you're almost too specific with your technique training and maybe not doing enough strength training?
So there's kind of a couple of different kind of not indicators, but there's different groups and different people who would have not better technique, but who would favor technique over kind of brute strength when they're doing their lifts. So someone who might be kind of deficient in strength and better technique would be someone who has a very low ratio or percentage efficiency of their kind of back squat to clean and jerk or snatch, or clean and jerk to their front squat. So whose percentage, someone who's clean and jerking, like we have examples of kind of amateur lifters clean and jerking their 1RM front squat, or someone who's like snatching nearly 80% of their back squat or something like that. You know, someone who's very, very close to their strength lifts would be one indicator of someone who is high on the technique end of proficiency, but low on the absolute strength. Usually we will move on then to someone, female lifters or women lifters usually rely on technique more than they do strength, and that's usually because on average women who are not enhanced will have less muscle mass than men. They won't be able to produce as much force on average, so very often they will have better technique as they don't favor strength in relying on muscling through a lift, so they'll usually end up with nicer technique, especially in amateur weightlifters. They will usually have smoother technique as well. Lighter lifters, even on the elite level, will have not so I'm going to say better technique than the heavier lifters, but very often rely on better technique, and they will usually see this in somewhere kind of like lower bar speed. So the velocity of the bar won't be moving as fast as heavier lifters because they're not as strong, but their body speed, so their ability to get under the bar, so like maximum bar height, will be a lot lower. So their time from kind of time to fixation to like maximum bar height, the difference between those two will be minimal, be very, very small. Some of them, if you look at like All Things Gym, have done kind of overlay of like maximum pull height to catch height, and they are nearly identical. Like there'll be millimeters between the two of them.
Yeah.
So that'll usually be an indicator of someone who's relying on technique over strength. And honestly, if you have to pick between the two groups, I would pick someone who relies on technique over strength all the time, really.
So then, talking about like the group of people who rely on their strength rather than their technical proficiency, there's some key indicators, right? So to contrast Gareth's one, a lot of the time it'll be heavier weight classes. It'll usually be people who aren't as experienced in the sport, so they don't have that motor pattern built up, or they're not as proficient with the motor pattern as an experienced lifter would be. They'll also tend to have like certain quirks whereby a power snatch will be easier than a full snatch for them to do, or a power clean will be easier than a full clean, or they might be able to push press or power jerk something a lot heavier than what their split jerk would be. What you're seeing here is you're seeing they favor lifts with a higher margin for error. So in a power snatch, if I'm catching it in an almost stood up position or above parallel position, I have a huge margin for error because I can move my center of mass around a lot. If I'm sitting in the bottom of a catch position, I don't have the ability to kind of manipulate where my center of mass is, and particularly front to back, so I'll tend to miss more lifts. When you see this, so like if people are way more proficient with a power, or even if their power is the same as their full lift, they should probably be looking to do some of that kind of technique based training, and probably de-emphasizing their strength and power work. The last thing then is like the actual effort or the energy it takes them to do lifts is usually much, much lower. So somebody who might have very, very good technique, but the weights they're lifting are so relatively heavy for them, they'll often be extremely fatigued by the kind of maximal intensities, the heavy weights, whereas somebody who is possibly much, much stronger than the lifts they're doing at the moment, they'll often not be fatigued by any of their working sets.
So we want to talk a little bit now how we would identify if you are, which group you lie in, so in terms of strength over technique or technique over strength in terms of an amateur lifter. So this is primarily talking about you, the viewer, and how you would identify where you are so you can kind of adjust your training and realign your goals and what you're doing in your training to bring these into more of an even balance, okay? So one of the things we will see in a lifter who is a lot stronger, paradoxically, is they will often miss more. So if we see someone who, for example, would have been maybe a powerlifter or a long-term CrossFitter and they've done a lot of strength work and they've bigger back squats and they're coming in, very often, because their technique is very erratic, because they rely on their strength more often, they'll miss more lifts because they'll be in consistent positions. They rely more on muscular endurance, or not muscular endurance, but they will rely more on their kind of ability to power through a lift, so they'll fatigue more often through the sessions in terms of they'll probably end up with more of a pump really, so they'll end up missing lifts because they'll be more fatigued in ways that we normally don't see in lifters when they are relying on better technique. Then very often we'll see kind of as a moving down the road from that is lifters who rely on strength more often will tend to power their lifts more and feel like it's easier for them to power their lifts more. So they'll be like, I can power clean 100% of their max, or in some cases power clean 110 or 120% of their clean. Oftentimes as well, when we see lifters who are vastly superior in terms of strength, their mobility will be lacking a little bit, and this will become from kind of adaptations to their tendon systems and their ligaments when they've ability to apply a lot of force at low speeds, and they'll kind of tendons become stiffer, so it makes it a little bit harder for them if they spend a long time not doing any kind of mobility work or moving through the positions you need for Olympic weightlifting. So when they are this, you'll kind of be a little bit stiffer in the lifts, and that's one of the reasons you'll end up powering more. Now moving to the other group, so a group who is relying on technique more than strength. So what you'll often see is a lifter, for example, who was clean and jerking 150 kilos with a 160 by 2 front squat. Very often you'll see that this clean and jerk is far more fatiguing than the lifter who, for example, would have a 200 kilo clean and jerk. So if both of our maxes are 150 kilos, but our lifter with a lower clean and or lower front squat to our clean and jerk, so that 150, so for just doubling 160 and it's balls out, you may only one shot at that 150 kilo clean and jerk, and it may fatigue you not only in that particular session, but it may fatigue you for a whole week, whereas the lifter with a 200 front squat or in excess of that clean jerk and 150 may fatigue them for 5 minutes and they may be fine, and the next day or two they may be fully recovered. So then the last group we have in terms of relying on technique over strength is kind of following on from that, is our ratios of those lifts will be much, much smaller, and that'll be very obvious for you. So now, not often I would buy into you need to bring your lifts into a ratio, but if your ratios are too close, that's the only time I would particularly worry about that. And honestly, you won't need to calculate this. If you're clean and jerking 150 kilos and you can barely front squat 160, then I think it's pretty clear that your ratios are too close. So take a look at yourself, take at your max front squat and your max deadlift and what kind of snatch clean jerk you're doing, and then try and identify which group you lie in there and if you tick any of these boxes.
Okay, so if you've kind of listened to what we said, if you're in the okay, I have really good technique, but maybe my strength numbers are quite low group. If you're kind of banded in there with from what we've said, what are you going to do moving on from this video today? There's probably like 2 or 3 different ways I'd go about this. The first one is if you haven't done a kind of strength cycle, or if you haven't focused on your strength in a while, I think a great place to start would just be picking your front squat, picking your back squat, trying to make a goal around that. Pick something like 2-3 months down the road and then just focus on that for the next 2 or 3 months. So build some volume, do some work where it's kind of like the main priority of certain sessions. Really focus on it, try and hit a new PB or try and get back to kind of a recent PB. And so like make that the focus of your training. The next thing I'd say is start looking at kind of if you've imbalances between your like anterior chain and posterior chain. So you might have a really strong deadlift because you have a strong back and hamstrings and glutes, but your squat might be very poor. So you might have weak quads, weak knees, weak anterior core musculature. So if it is something like that you have an imbalance in, then obviously focus on the weaker of the two. The last thing I'd say then would be, a lot of the time we have people who are very, very technically proficient, but in some way like weak in inverted commas. They might be very, very flexible a lot of the time, but their mobility, so their ability to control movement or control themselves through a range of motion might be quite poor. So an example of that would be somebody who, when they go overhead with a jerk, it's very, very unstable, so their shoulders can't stabilize, or they might have hypermobility in certain joints like the wrist or the elbow. I'd start then focusing on some stability work. So that might be some banded presses, that might be some bottoms up kettlebell presses, that might be some like core stability work or anti-rotation work. So there are the three things. I'd pick a lift and try and hit some PBs in it for a strength movement. I'd look at imbalances in my strength or power outputs and try and make sure I'm as balanced a system as possible. And then the last thing I do is look at flexibility and mobility and make sure I'm stable in each position.
If you are looking for some help, by the way, just a little head here. If you have in need of some help with your strength work, so we have the Seeker Rotating Your Squat program, probably one of the best squat programs on the market. Seeker Press, which is primarily bench or more likely strict press and upper body work, and then of course our newest program is Seeker Pull, a 10-week deadlift program. So if you were looking for strength work,
insert plug here.
So moving on to the next group, if you have massively in excess or you've big reserves of strength in comparison to technique, this is actually a much harder group to fix because the technique is intricate and there's a lot of variables going into technique and you have a lot of issues. So your mobility may be poor. So if you lack any adequate mobility, you very likely need to address this before you can start really improving your technique, because if you can't hit a position without a bar, there's no way you're going to be able to hit it under load while trying to move at speed. So the first group you need to look at is if you are in excessive strength and you are lacking mobility or flexibility, then you have to address this and you have to hit this nail on the head before you can really and truly start improving your technique. So if you've addressed this and you've addressed your mobility, or you don't have this issue, and you may not, but it is a concern for people if you are in a large excessive technique, so your ratios are very, very high. So if you have address these, you move on. You really need to look at having a higher percentage of snatch and clean and jerk in your training. So full lifts, practicing these. Very likely you will need to eliminate, so we're talking really about amateur and intermediate lifters here. You need to eliminate, probably there's a good chance you may need to remove power snatch and power clean from your training for a while. So a lot of times heavier or stronger lifters tend to power or over pull things. So even if they're not over pulling things into a power snatch, they may be over pulling and riding the lift down into a full squat or a full clean. So you may need to eliminate your power snatch, power clean for a while. I would eliminate a lot of excess upper body strength work as well for a small while. So eventually we'll need to bring this back in. But I would still, what's important is you don't leave your strength deteriorate too much. So keep your squat strong, maintain it, make sure it stays high. So don't let it drop off altogether. So that would be too much of a mistake as well. So maybe that you need a bigger back squat in terms of the classic ratios. But keep your squat strong, but really, really prioritize your snatch and your clean and jerk. So keep all your squats and your pulls at the end of your session. You can use some kind of use minimal volume with these, okay? So for a period of time you may need to look at just maintaining them, so making sure you don't kind of drop below 90% in these, so but not really pushing these. So make sure you're fresh for every snatch, clean, jerk session. So if you are someone of kind of a number minded, or you feel confident enough in terms of your programming, try get a number of lifts you have over like 90%, 80% and 70% of your snatch, clean and jerk, and then look at the similar number for your squats and your cleans, okay? And try balance these numbers appropriately, and try over time increase your snatch and clean and jerk numbers in the different percentages, and then you can kind of compare these with your strength numbers. Now this might sound a little bit daunting, but realistically you just need to sit down, make sure you've recorded all your training, or start recording your training, and then start getting some kind of gauge of progress in these, or what kind of volume of each of these lifts you're doing. And if you see a large number, so you don't need to know exactly which is which, and you don't need to know how many numbers you're doing, but if you see 50% of your training reps are all squats and clean and jerks, or squats and pulls, and then you look at your snatch, clean, jerk, and they only make up 25% of your training, then you know you have a huge issue there. So try gradually increase this. Like, you don't have to do this, but if you are diligent and you are serious about your weightlifting, it is worthwhile doing it just once or twice every so often, just to see what you're getting. And then really, what I would say is you cannot go wrong with getting a good coach. So that's one thing we always talk about in weightlifting is technique. Strength is very easy to fix. You just need consistency and a bit of patience. Technique requires patience, consistency, but a knowledge of the lifts, like a really deep knowledge of the lifts, knowing how to adjust things. Finally, as well, for people who are stronger, unfortunately, you will have to kind of leave your ego at the door. And I know you see this a lot at CrossFit gyms and boxes.
Yeah.
Leave your ego at the door, but unfortunately, you will have to do this. So this is why I was mentioned earlier. Female weightlifters often have better technique is because they can't rely on their strength. Now you need to put yourself in a position where you don't rely on your strength.
Yeah.
So adjust it. Acknowledge that your strength for now is a hindrance in some ways. It does allow you to train a lot more, so that's one of the benefits. So you can do a lot more snatch, clean, jerk for now. So use that to your benefit. Use your excess strength doing lots more full snatch and full clean and jerk. You know, one of the issues too as well is you don't have to worry so much about particular cues and addressing the lifts. One thing that will benefit you a lot is just doing a lot of snatch, clean, jerk. Sometimes lifters want, and it's funny, we talked about this with Aaron Kroll on the podcast where he got one cue from one of his coaches who are world-class coaches. Like he got one every 6 months. So too often people want a lot of
new thing every week.
Yeah.
And like, if you fix issues like that in a week, they probably weren't big enough issues that you needed to fix them. And it's definitely not so, like you're either a phenomenally skilled learner or else it's not fixed properly.
You just need time lifting. So
Yeah.
issues will fix themselves because some of the cues are of course conscious cues, but others are just subconscious ability to, your body is very good at kind of balancing the whole system, and it needs to learn how to do these subconsciously. So you need to spend more time doing snatch and clean and jerk. So just kind of run through that again. I suppose for this more strength for technique, you have to limit your number of squats and pulls. So increase the number of snatch, clean, jerks if you're not already. You have to give it time, potentially find a coach if at all possible, and then just kind of leave your ego aside. Be very, very diligent with your lifts. So if you feel like you muscle through a lift and it doesn't look perfect, don't exceed a weight that you can't do with perfect technique. And you would need to take potentially up to 4 or 5 steps backwards here for 20 steps forward in the next 5 years. So if you are serious about weightlifting, just take that step back, and then you will be worth in the long run. It may be a little bit frustrating in the short term, but it will pay off, especially if you are able to overcome your kind of bring up your snatch, clean, jerk numbers with your practice. And the potential for you, of course, is there if you just give it a bit of time.
Yeah.
Thanks for watching.
Let us know if there's other theory of training videos you're interested in seeing. Pop them in the comments below. Also, if you have general questions, you can pop them in the comments below, or else shoot us a DM on Instagram. It's just @SeekAStrength.
Thank you.